Winning the state championship was the best thing that ever happened to me. I played basketball for my college team, and this year we were unstable. We had the skills, the chemistry, and the drive. That final game was intense, but when the buzzer rang and we were crowned state champions, it felt like we had climbed a mountain. I could feel the adrenaline rush in my blood, but little did I know what would happen later that night would make everything else fade into the background. After the game, our team captain, Brian, insisted on throwing a party to celebrate. He had this old farm about 45 minutes outside of town. His family owned it, but no one lived there anymore. It was one of those places that gave off a vibe. Isolated, surrounded by woods, and too far away for anyone to bother us. We arrived around 9 and before I knew it, the beer flowed like water. I'm not much of a drinker, but tonight was an exception. We were champions after all. I drank a lot. Everyone was cheering, laughing, and blasting music so loud that the windows rattled. The world was spinning, but I didn't care. The feeling of winning made everything else seem insignificant. Eventually, the party started to die down. People left in small groups, but I stayed later than most, still buzzing from the alcohol and the excitement. When I decided to leave, it was past 2:30 in the morning, and I could barely walk straight. But I wasn't going to crash on Brian's couch. I wanted to get home, get into my bed and sleep off the craziness of the night. The drive back was long and eerie. I took Route 41, a highway that cuts through miles of forest. It's the road where your headlights are the only source of light for miles. The trees on both sides looming like giants, stretching toward each other, blocking out the moon. Every time I passed an empty field or an old crumbling house, my mind played tricks on me, imagining shapes in the shadows. But I just kept driving. Must have been around 3 a.m. when it happened. I was a few miles from the next town, tired and still a little drunk, but I forced myself to stay alert. That's when I saw it. A kid, a little boy, standing right in the middle of the highway. I slammed the brakes, my heart racing. He couldn't have been older than 10. Just standing there, wearing old, tattered clothes like something out of the His face was pale, almost sickly, and his eyes, there was something off about them. They were too wide, too dark. He didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there staring right at me. I swerved trying to avoid him. The car spun out, tires breaching, and before I knew it, I slammed into a tree. The impact jolted me forward, my head banging against the steering wheel. For a moment, everything was a blur of pain and confusion. The airbag didn't deploy, of course. This was an old car, my dad's actually, and I cursed under my breath, tasting blood. But then I remembered the kid. I shot up and in my seat, eyes scanning the road. Nothing, no kid. Just the empty stretch of highway and my busted car against a tree. I stumbled out the night air cool against my face. My head was pounding, but all I could think about was that boy. Where had he gone? He was right there in front of my car. I looked up and down the road, squinting into the shadows between the trees. There wasn't a sound, no footsteps, no movement. Just the distant hum of insects and the soft rustling of the leaves in the breeze. I walked around the car, my legs shaky. There were no other cars, no sign of anyone else on the road. I even checked under the car, half expecting to see him lying there, but there was nothing. It was like he had never existed, but I knew what I saw. He was there, I didn't imagine it. I leaned against the car, staring into the forest. I thought about walking into the woods, calling out for the kid. But something deep inside me told me not to. Something about those trees, that dark road, it felt wrong. Eventually, I got back in the car. The engine started, but it was making a terrible grinding noise. I didn't care. I just wanted to get out of there. I drove slowly the rest of the way, my eyes glued to the road, terrified that the boy might appear again. I made it home, but that night stuck with me. No one believes me, of course. They say it was the alcohol, or maybe I fell asleep at the wheel, but I know what I saw. I was just over 16 then, and my family usually ordered Papa John's pizza for delivery. But this time, my mom decided to pick it up to give me some driving practice. We went earlier than planned, hoping to provide me with extra time behind the wheel. It turned out well as the pizza was finished earlier than expected, so everything seemed to be going smoothly. We grabbed the pizza and headed home, ready for dinner. As we were setting up, about 5 minutes after getting back, a loud engine noise started heard rumbling outside. It grew louder and louder with each passing second. Then in the blink of an eye, We saw a bright red blur zip past our window so fast we could barely register it. Almost immediately there was a loud crash, followed by the terrible sound of scraping metal. We rushed to the window and saw a bright red sports car that had slammed into a minivan down the street. Both vehicles were completely wrecked, crumpled from the impact. My mom immediately ran outside to check if anyone hurt, and to call for help while my brother and I were told to stay inside and continue eating. We didn't leave the house until the adults needed help keeping the little kids occupied while they handled the chaotic scene outside. It turned out that 2 separate gatherings were happening on our street that day. One was a family reunion at our next-door neighbor's house, and the other was at the top of the street, hosted by the guy who owned the red sports car. But things at the party had gone downhill fast. An unknown man had shown up at the party, serving drugs and alcohol to the guests, especially the car's owner. While everyone was distracted, this guy started stealing things from the house, sneaking off with whatever he could find. After grabbing a load of valuables, he made his boldest move yet. He stole the host's red sports car. The thief sped off down the street, but he didn't get far before catching the attention of the police. They had noticed him blowing past speed limits, so they decided to chase him. Panicking, the thief drove even faster to try and escape the police, pushing the car to its limits. But in his rush, he lost control, which led to him crashing head-on into the minivan parked down the street. Thankfully, despite the destruction, the owner of the minivan, our neighbor's daughter, was incredibly lucky. She had been just about to leave with everything packed in the back of the van and ready to go. The only thing left was to get her baby, who was inside with her. Normally, the baby was quiet, but this time the baby suddenly started screaming. Because of this, the daughter stayed inside to comfort her baby, instead of heading out to the van right away. That delay saved their lives. Had the baby not cried, both mother and child would have been in the van at the moment the sports car collided with it. It was chilling to think about how close it had come. As I stood there thinking about it, I realized something else. My family had left to pick up the pizza earlier than we normally would have. And on top of that, the pizza was ready ahead of schedule. Both of those things rarely happened, based on the usual time it took for the pizza to be ready. And considering my inexperience with driving, we should have been on that street right around the time that red sports car sped by. I knew I wouldn't have been skilled enough to avoid a car going that fast, and the thought of what could have happened sent a chill through me. The man who stole the car and caused the crash survived, but was arrested on the spot after the accident. He was later charged with theft, reckless driving, and endangering lives. The family's insurance helped them replace the destroyed van, and although the emotional shock lingered, everyone was just relieved that no one had been seriously injured or killed in the wreck. It was the fall of 1996, a night etched into my memory like a scar. It was one of those rainy nights where the sky seemed angry, and the world felt heavier. The storm had been raging for hours, and the roads were slick and treacherous. I was driving my old beat-up sedan along Route 47, my friend. Ben was in the passenger seat, nervously tapping his foot. He hated driving in the rain, but we didn't have much of a choice. We were coming back from a small family gathering, hours away from home, and the weather had taken a sudden turn for the worse. The rain beat down on the windshield, and even with the wipes working overtime, I could barely see the road ahead. The headlights illuminated only a few feet in front of the car, casting teary shadows on the wet asphalt. I kept my grip tight on the steering wheel, my knuckles white, trying to focus on keeping us on the road. Ben kept glancing out the window, but there wasn't much to see, just endless sheets of rain pouring from the sky. Out of nowhere, we heard a loud breach. It took me a second to realize that it wasn't coming from us. It was another car. I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw a pair of headlights speeding toward us. They were coming too fast. When we did react, the car behind us swerved, trying to avoid us, but ended up clipping the back of our car. The impact sent us spinning out of control. I could feel the tires lose their grip on the road, and in a matter of seconds, we were sliding sideways. Everything felt like it was moving in slow motion. The car skidded toward the guardrail, and all I could do was hold on, bracing for the inevitable crash. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled the air as we poked into the guardrail. The front of the car crumbling like a tin can, My head whipped forward and the seatbelt dug painfully into my chest. When we finally came to a stop, there was an eerie silence. The only sound was the rain pounding on the roof of the car and the faint of steam rising from the wrecked engine. My heart was racing and my body was shaking. I turned to Ben, but he wasn't moving. Panic surged through me as I tried to unbuckle my seatbelt, my hands trembling. I called his name, hoping he was just dazed, but there was no response. I managed to unbuckle myself and turned toward him again. His head was slumped to the side, blood dripping from a gash on his forehead. I reached over and shook him gently, my voice shaky as I called his name again. This time he stirred, groaning in pain. Relief washed over me for a moment, but it quickly faded when I looked down at his legs. The front of the car had been crushed inward, and his right leg was pinned beneath the twisted metal. My stomach churned at the sight. I didn't know what to do. The rain was still coming down hard, and the visibility was almost zero. No one else was on the road, and there was no way I could move the wreckage by myself. I reached for my phone, but there was no signal. Not surprising for this part of the highway. I tried to comfort Ben as best as I could, but he was in and out of consciousness, his face pale and sweaty. Time seemed to stretch on forever. I was scared, helpless, and completely alone in the middle of a storm with my friend barely hanging on. It felt like an eternity before I saw flashing lights through the rain. A car pulled up behind us and 2 paramedics rushed over. They worked quickly, but I could see the grim expressions on their faces when they realized the extent of Ben's injury. His leg was too far gone, crushed beyond repair. I stood there in shock, watching as they cut him free and loaded him onto a stretcher. The realization that he was about to lose his leg hit me like a punch to the gut, but there was nothing I could do. The hospital later confirmed what I already knew. Ben's leg had to be amputated. The crash had shattered it completely, leaving no other option. I still think about that night sometimes. The rain, the darkness, and the sound of the crash replaying in my head. It was a night that changed everything in the blink of an eye, a reminder of how quickly things can go wrong.